In this, the seventh lesson of the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we explore the thinking of the first generation of economists as they modify or abandon the perspectives contained in the 2 centuries of thought by their predecessor political economists. In a very real sense, the economists were climbing down into a dark pit from which little light could be shed on the causes of real-world occurrences. As Henry George acknowledged in his final book, The Science of Political Economy, his effort to rebuild political economy on sound principles, supported by observation as well as deductive reasoning, had failed to find very many defenders among other political economists. He wrote, "Not only are no subjects so widely and frequently discussed as those that come within the province of political economy, but every university and college has now its professor of the science, whose special business is to study and to teach it. But nowhere are inadequacy and confusion more apparent than in the writings of these men, nor is anything so likely to give the impression that there is not and cannot be a real science of political economy." Henry George's eldest son, possessed of a penetrating intellect similar to that of his father, attempted to continue the struggle on behalf of the science in which his father had placed so much faith. He addressed the role of the university in his book, The Menace of Privilege, published in 1905. Henry George Jr. wrote, "Who are the men of means we nowadays find among our university regents and trustees, and who from without contribute so handsomely toward endowment funds? They are princes of privilege. Generally, they are steam railroad or municipal franchise or tariff or land-owning magnates, or bankers who back or lawyers who advise the large privilege-owning corporations. They are the blood royal of the house of privilege." To prove his point, Henry George Jr. quoted from a 1903 article by Yale University President Arthur Twining Hadley. Hadley wrote, "Modern university teaching costs more money per capita than it ever did before. A university is more likely to obtain this money if it gives the property owners reason to believe that vested rights will not be interfered with. If we recognize vested rights in order to secure the means of progress in physical science, is there not danger that we shall stifle the spirit of independence, which is equally important as a means of progress in moral science?" The men referred to by Henry George Jr. were often described as self-made men who had risen to great heights and to great wealth by their great ability. The list included men who would donate considerable amounts of money to establish universities or university departments. Ezra Cornell built a fortune as a telegraph magnate. He provided the funds to establish Cornell University in 1865. Cornelius Vanderbilt acquired an enormous fortune in the shipping and railroad industries. Vanderbilt University was named after him after providing a $900,000 gift. In 1876, Johns Hopkins founded the Baltimore University named after him with gifts totaling $7 million. Much of his fortune came from railroad building. Another railroad magnate, Leland Stanford, founded Stanford University in 1890 with gifts totaling $10 million. And John D. Rockefeller, his fortune made by establishing a giant oil monopoly, founded the University of Chicago in 1890 with gifts totaling $33 million. Among the leaders of the new economics were several who embraced the utilitarian principle that man always seeks pleasure and avoids pain. They then developed sophisticated theories of marginal utility and asserted that price has the power to clear virtually all markets. As the 19th century ended, a cadre of economics professors headed by John Bates Clark, Carl Menger, and Leon Walras resurrected utilitarian principles. They did not write land out of economics, but argued that price cleared the market for land as efficiently as for labor or capital goods. One of the clearest explanations of their objectives I have found is in a 2008 paper by University of California professor of history Mary Ferner. Professor Ferner writes, "At the century's end, economists fashioned the first American statement of a productivity theory of factor shares and distribution. This new theory, presented in John Bates Clark's The Distribution of Wealth, took aim at competing supply-side, cost of production theories featured in both classical liberalism and Marxian socialism. In this American version of neoclassical theory, the value, price, in wages, interest, or rent of a specific input to production was based on the utility supplied by the final increment of each that could be profitably employed. Assuming that in modern production all these units were interchangeable, the value of the final increment was the price of all preceding units." John Bates Clark ignored reality to such an extent that he actually made the argument that land speculation does not reward landowners with an unearned income. Responding to Henry George's reasoning that the rent of land is unearned by any individual, Clark asserted that under perfectly competitive market conditions, the return to each factor of production is equal to its marginal productivity. By this he meant market forces ensure that each factor owner receives a just return. He never questioned the right of individuals or entities to claim ownership to nature. After all, his discipline was economics and not moral philosophy. In the real world, where the purely competitive market is non-existent, the last thing the industrial and financial giants wanted was competition, particularly from external competitors. This political reality, captured in this cartoon, was appreciated by leading economics professors. One such economics professor was Frank Taussig, who studied at Harvard University and was appointed a professor in 1892. On the desire by business for protection, Taussig observed, "Mercantilist notions, universally discarded though they are by the well-informed, affect the policy of nations, not only by strengthening the movement toward protection, but in other ways also. There was an arena of investigation where the prudent economist must not go." As he stated, complex political and social questions present themselves quite beyond the scope of a book on economics. Teaching the next generation of economics professors coming out of Harvard, Taussig provided the textbook and a quarterly journal of economics to spread neoclassical economic analysis throughout the United States. These were powerful tools in the establishment of a new orthodoxy, adherence to which was required for professional recognition and advancement. In many instances, economists seem to be on the side of monopolistic corporate and financial interests without regard for the common good, particularly when the common good ran counter to conventional wisdom of what made the American system successful. As economist Herbert Davenport put it, "Economists of all people dread the stigma of radicalism. Far better to elucidate and emphasize the excellent aspects of things as they are than to question the economic harmonies or to doubt the validity and the beneficence of natural law or to bring in question the deft guiding of the divine hand." Only a few dared to express dissent. Chief among this group was John R. Commons, whose religious upbringing caused him to be a lifelong advocate for social justice. Commons studied economics under Richard Ely at Johns Hopkins University and eventually joined the faculty of the University of Wisconsin in 1902. He also found it quite enlightening to learn he was also a member of the university's Henry George Club. However, in his writing, Commons revealed that he clearly understood the reasons why the new economics had removed land as a distinct factor of production. He wrote, "Ricardo's distinction of unearned rent disappears because all future incomes, no matter how monopolistic, discriminatory, or unfair, are looked upon as future rents to be paid for the use of any and all kinds of property, so that capital become the present discounted value of those future rents." Economists as economists were isolating themselves from the political that was integral to political economy. At the same time, government could be described as a very powerful externality affecting the natural laws of wealth production and distribution. Thus, it was primarily outside academic circles that the calls for reform of systems of land tenure and other monopoly licenses continued after the death of Henry George. A very young Winston Churchill campaigned for Parliament in 1909 on a platform that demanded an end to the monopoly of land. In one speech, he declared, "It is quite true that land monopoly is not the only monopoly which exists, but it is by far the greatest of monopolies. It is a perpetual monopoly, and it is the mother of all other forms of monopoly." It is quite true that unearned increments in land are not the only form of unearned or undeserved profit which individuals are able to secure, but it is the principal form of unearned increment which is derived from processes which are not merely not beneficial, but which are positively detrimental to the general public. Land, which is a necessity of human existence, which is the original source of all wealth, which is strictly limited in extent, which is fixed in geographical position. Land, I say, differs from all other forms of property in these primary and fundamental conditions. In the United States, the concentrated control over what had been the public domain was not yet an issue debated in the Congress. The great concern was over the arrival of immigrants from everywhere around the globe. In his annual message to the Congress in 1905, Theodore Roosevelt declared, "We cannot have too much immigration of the right sort, and we should have none whatever of the wrong sort. It is our right and duty to consider his moral and social quality. His standard of living should be such that he will not, by pressure of competition, lower the standard of living of our own wage workers, for it must ever be a prime object of our legislation to keep high their standard of living." Progressive journalists such as Lincoln Steffens called for new laws to tame the monopolies. In his autobiography, Steffens recalled, "What big and little businesses all had in common was not size, but the need of privileges, franchises, and special legislation, which required legislative corruption, protective tariffs, interpretations of laws in their special interest, or leniency or protection in the enforcement of laws, calling for pulls with judges, prosecutors, and the police." Henry Demarest Lloyd, editor of a Chicago newspaper, led the crusade against monopolies. In 1894, his book, Wealth Against Commonwealth, brought to light the monopolistic business practices of Standard Oil. He went right to the heart of the matter. "Nature is rich, but everywhere man, the heir of nature, is poor. Never since time began have all the sons and daughters of men been all warm and all filled and all shod and roofed. holding back the riches of the earth, sea, and sky from their fellows who famish and freeze in the dark, the syndicates, trusts, combinations assert the right for their private profit to regulate the consumption by the people of the necessities of life and to control production, not by the needs of humanity, but by the desires of a few for dividends. We now reach the end of Lesson 7.